I hadn't been back to Grandpa's farm in 15 years, not since I was 12, and my parents decided city life was better for us. Now, standing in the gravel driveway with my duffel bag and a crumpled inheritance letter, everything looked smaller than I remembered. The white farmhouse needed paint, the red barn leaned slightly to the left, and the fields stretched endlessly under an October sky. My Uncle Ray emerged from the house, his face already twisted with displeasure. He'd been living here since Grandpa died 3 months ago, managing the property while the lawyers sorted everything out. His work boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, and I could smell cigarettes and motor oil on his clothes. "So you actually came," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Figured you'd just sell from the city like all the other inheritance brats." I adjusted my grip on the bag. "The will says I have 6 months to decide. I thought I'd spend some time here first." Ray spat into the dirt. "There's nothing for you here, kid. This place needs work. You city folks don't understand. Real work. Dirty work." He gestured toward the barn. "That old building's ready to fall down, the tractor's busted, and winter's coming. You'll be back in Boston before Thanksgiving." But something in his tone made me want to prove him wrong. Grandpa had left me this place for a reason, and I intended to find out what that was. The farmhouse felt hollow without Grandpa's presence. His coffee mug still sat by the kitchen sink, and his worn flannel shirts hung in the bedroom closet like ghosts. I'd taken the small guest room upstairs, giving Ray space to continue his routine while I figured things out. The first week passed in a blur of repair attempts and frustrating conversations with Ray. Every suggestion I made was met with dismissal, every question answered with condescension. When I asked about the farm's finances, he'd wave me off. When I mentioned updating some of the equipment, he'd laugh. "Your grandpa was old school," Ray would say. "Didn't trust banks, didn't trust computers, didn't trust much of anything modern, just worked the land the way his daddy did." I spent my days exploring the property, reacquainting myself with childhood memories. The old oak tree where I'd built a treehouse still stood tall. The creek that ran along the eastern border babbled the same song I remembered. But everything felt different, older, more fragile. The barn drew my attention most. Ray was right, it did need work. The roof had several loose shingles, and some of the siding had warped with age. But there was something about the structure that fascinated me, perhaps because Grandpa had spent so much time there. I found myself walking around it in the evenings, studying its construction, imagining the decades of harvests it had sheltered. Little did I know that beneath my feet lay secrets that would change everything. By the 3rd week, I'd established something resembling a routine. Coffee at dawn, morning chores, what few Ray would let me do, afternoons exploring the property, evenings reading Grandpa's old farming journals by lamplight. The journals were fascinating, detailed records of crop rotations, weather patterns, and local gossip dating back 40 years. But it was what wasn't in the journals that started to puzzle me. There were gaps, whole months missing from certain years, and whenever Grandpa mentioned the barn in his entries, the writing became oddly formal, almost coded. Barn maintenance completed as planned. Structural adjustments proceeding smoothly. Foundation work successful. Foundation work. The barn sat on a simple concrete pad. Nothing fancy. What kind of foundation work could he have meant? I mentioned this to Ray over dinner, but he just shrugged. "Your grandpa was always tinkering with something, probably just replacing a beam or fixing the floor." That night, I dreamed about the barn. In the dream, I could hear Grandpa's voice calling to me from somewhere below ground, but when I tried to find him, the floorboards beneath my feet turned to quicksand. I woke with a start, moonlight streaming through my bedroom window. The dream had felt so real, I could still hear the echo of Grandpa's voice. Unable to shake the feeling, I dressed quietly and stepped outside. The barn stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a light flickering in one of the windows. But when I blinked, there was only darkness and the sound of autumn wind through the eaves. Ray's behavior grew stranger as the days passed. I'd catch him watching me from the kitchen window when I walked near the barn, and he'd quickly look away when our eyes met. He started locking the barn doors at night, something Grandpa never did, according to the neighbors I'd begun chatting with at the local diner. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the place, remembered me from childhood visits. "Your grandpa was so proud of you," she'd say, refilling my coffee cup, "always talking about his smart grandson in the big city. He had big plans for that farm, you know." "What kind of plans?" She'd glance around conspiratorially. "He never said exactly, but he was always working on some project, buying supplies in town, hauling things out to that barn. Your Uncle Ray was mighty interested in whatever it was." This confirmed my growing suspicions. Ray's hostility wasn't just about not wanting me around. There was something specific he was trying to hide. I started paying closer attention to his movements. He spent a lot of time in the barn, but whenever I approached, he'd emerge quickly, often looking flustered. He'd installed a new padlock on the main doors, claiming it was for security, but I noticed he kept the key on a chain around his neck. One evening, I positioned myself in the upstairs window with a pair of binoculars I'd found in Grandpa's closet. Ray entered the barn around 10 p.m. and didn't emerge for 2 hours. When he finally did, he was carrying a large canvas bag that definitely hadn't been there when he went in. Whatever was hidden in that barn, Ray was systematically removing it. I needed to get inside that barn, but Ray rarely left the property. My opportunity came when he announced he was driving to the county seat for supplies, a trip that would take most of the day. The moment his truck disappeared down the dirt road, I grabbed a crowbar from the tool shed and headed for the barn. The new padlock was heavy-duty, but the hasp it was attached to was old and rusted. With some careful prying, I managed to work it loose from the wood. The barn doors swung open with a familiar creak, and late morning sunlight streamed across the interior. Everything looked normal at first. Hay bales stacked against the walls, old farming equipment covered with tarps, tools hanging from wooden pegs. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed irregularities. There were drag marks in the dirt floor, and several areas where the ground seemed disturbed. Some of the hay bales had been moved recently. I could tell because the dust patterns underneath didn't match the outlines above. I started moving bales, checking behind them, looking for anything unusual. Most revealed nothing but more dirt floor and the occasional mouse nest. But near the back corner, behind a stack that reached almost to the ceiling, I found something interesting. A section of the floor looked different. The dirt was a slightly different color, more compact, as if it had been recently disturbed and then carefully smoothed over. When I knelt and pressed my hand against it, the ground felt hollow underneath. I grabbed a shovel and began digging carefully. 6 inches down, my blade struck wood. My heart started racing as I cleared away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be a wooden trapdoor built flush with the barn floor. The trapdoor was heavier than I expected, built from thick oak planks and held together with hand-forged iron hardware that looked decades old. It took considerable effort to lift, but when I finally managed it, the hinges groaned open to reveal a wooden ladder descending into darkness. The smell that rose from the opening was musty but not unpleasant, old wood, earth, and something else I couldn't identify. I found a flashlight in the barn and pointed it down into the hole. The ladder descended about 8 feet to what appeared to be a concrete floor. My hands shook as I climbed down. At the bottom, I found myself in a rectangular room about 12 feet by 20 feet, with concrete walls and a surprisingly sophisticated lighting system. When I found the switch, fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing something I never could have imagined. The room was filled with wooden crates and metal filing cabinets. Maps covered one entire wall, topographical surveys of the local area with various locations marked in red ink. A desk sat in one corner, covered with ledgers and documents. But what caught my attention immediately were the display cases along the far wall. They contained artifacts, Native American pottery, arrowheads, jewelry, and tools, all carefully labeled and preserved. Some pieces looked ancient, while others appeared more recent. Each had a small card detailing where and when it had been found. I approached the desk with growing amazement. The ledgers contained meticulous records of archaeological finds dating back 30 years. Grandpa hadn't just been farming. He'd been conducting a systematic survey of the property, documenting every artifact he discovered. But as I read further, I realized this wasn't just a hobby. The records indicated the farm sat on what appeared to be a significant Native American settlement site, possibly dating back centuries. The more I read through Grandpa's records, the clearer the picture became. He'd been in contact with university archaeologists, historical societies, and tribal representatives. Letters in the filing cabinet showed ongoing discussions about the proper preservation and eventual donation of the artifacts. But there was more. Financial documents revealed that several museums and private collectors had expressed serious interest in purchasing the collection. The estimated values were staggering. Some individual pieces were worth thousands of dollars, and the complete collection could be worth hundreds of thousands. One letter, dated just 2 months before Grandpa's death, was particularly revealing. It was from a representative of the local Native American tribe, expressing gratitude for Grandpa's careful stewardship of their ancestors' artifacts and discussing plans for a joint preservation project. Another letter, this one from a private collector in Chicago, offered an enormous sum for the entire collection, no questions asked about provenance or legal ownership. I sat back in the desk chair, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Ray wasn't just trying to keep me away from the farm. He was trying to steal and sell Grandpa's archaeological collection. The canvas bag I'd seen him carrying probably contained some of the most valuable pieces. But there was something else in the files that made my blood run cold. A carbon copy of a letter Grandpa had written to his lawyer, dated 1 week before his death. In it, he expressed concerns about Ray's behavior and specifically requested that the farm and all its contents be left to me, with instructions that the artifact collection be handled according to his previous arrangements with the tribal representatives. Ray knew about the collection, knew about its value, and knew that Grandpa intended for it to be preserved rather than sold. That's why he'd been so determined to drive me away. He needed time to loot the collection before anyone discovered it. I spent the rest of the day photographing everything in the underground room, the artifacts, the documentation, the correspondence. If Ray was stealing from the collection, I needed proof. I also found Grandpa's detailed instructions for the preservation project, including contact information for Dr. Sarah Running Bear, the tribal representative he'd been working with. As evening approached, I carefully replaced the trapdoor and restored the barn to its previous appearance. I even managed to reattach the hasp so the padlock looked undisturbed. Ray couldn't know I'd discovered his secret, at least not yet. I was back in the house, apparently reading one of Grandpa's farming journals, when Ray's truck rumbled up the driveway. He came through the back door carrying grocery bags and hardware store purchases, his mood seeming lighter than usual. "How was your day, city boy?" he asked with what might have been genuine curiosity. "Get bored yet?" "Just reading Grandpa's journals," I replied, holding up the current volume. Fascinating stuff. He really kept detailed records. Something flickered across Ray's face. Suspicion, maybe concern. Yeah, he was obsessive about that kind of thing. Wrote down everything, sometimes things that weren't really anyone else's business. I nodded casually. I noticed some gaps, though. Whole months missing from some years, and some of the entries about barn work seemed kind of vague. Ray's hands stilled on the grocery bag he was unpacking. Like I told you before, he was always tinkering. Probably didn't think the details were important enough to record. but his voice had taken on that defensive tone I was beginning to recognize. He was lying, and we both knew it. That night, I barely slept. Tomorrow, I would have to decide how to handle what I'd discovered. Confronting Ry directly seemed dangerous. If he was desperate enough to steal from his own father's collection, there was no telling how he might react when cornered. I woke before dawn with a plan forming in my mind. Instead of confronting Ry directly, I would contact Dr. Running Bear and let her know what was happening. As the official tribal representative in Grandpa's preservation project, she would have the authority to intervene legally if necessary. I drove to town early, using the payphone at the diner to avoid any chance that Ry might overhear. Dr. Running Bear answered on the second ring, and when I explained who I was and what I'd discovered, her response was immediate and concerned. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "He spent years making sure those artifacts were properly documented and preserved. We had plans to establish a small museum on the property, honoring both the agricultural history and the native heritage of the land. My uncle has been removing things from the collection," I told her. "I think he's planning to sell them." The silence that followed was loaded with anger. "Can you meet me at the farm this afternoon? I'm driving down from the reservation now, and bring any documentation you found. We'll need it to stop this." After hanging up, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't alone in this anymore, but I still had to get through the day without arousing Ry's suspicion. I returned to find him in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading a farming supply catalog. He looked up when I entered, and I could have sworn there was something calculating in his expression. "Where'd you go so early?" he asked. "Just needed some air. Wanted to see the sunrise over the fields." I poured myself coffee, keeping my voice casual. "Thought I might work on cleaning up the barn today. It could use some organization." Ry's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "The barn's locked." I noticed. "Mind if I borrow the key?" Ry's reaction to my barn request was immediate and telling. His face flushed red, and he stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Stay away from the barn," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "There's nothing in there you need to worry about." I pretended to be confused by his vehemence. "It's just a barn, Ry. What's the big deal?" "The big deal is that some of the equipment in there is dangerous. Old machinery, rusty tools, unstable hay bales. I don't need you getting hurt and suing me," but his explanation sounded rehearsed, like he'd been preparing this excuse. And the keychain around his neck seemed to be burning a hole through his shirt, the way he kept touching it unconsciously. I spent the morning doing odd jobs around the property, always keeping the barn in sight. Ry made several trips there throughout the day, each time glancing around nervously before unlocking the doors. During his third visit, I positioned myself where I could see into the barn when he opened the doors. Even from a distance, I could tell the interior looked different from yesterday. Several of the hay bales had been moved, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like cardboard boxes stacked near the entrance. Boxes that definitely hadn't been there before. Around 2 in the afternoon, Dr. Running Bear's pickup truck turned into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as Ry emerged from the barn, quickly locking it behind him. His face was a mask of suspicion and hostility as he approached her truck. I stepped onto the porch, and Dr. Running Bear smiled when she saw me. She was a woman in her 50s with graying black hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You must be Tom's grandson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Running Bear. I was working with your grandfather on a very important project." Ry had reached us by then, and his expression was thunderous. "What kind of project?" Dr. Running Bear looked directly at Ry, her expression calm but firm. "The kind that involves respecting tribal heritage and following legal protocols for archaeological finds. The kind your father understood very well." Ry's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." She turned to me. May I see the documentation you found? I pulled out copies of the photographs I'd taken, spreading them on the porch table. Ray stepped closer, and I watched his expression change from confusion to recognition to pure panic as he realized what he was seeing. "Where did you get these?" he demanded. "From Grandpa's collection," I said simply, "the one you've been systematically looting." For a moment I thought Ray might try to deny everything. His mouth opened and closed several times, and he looked back and forth between Dr. Running Bear and me like a trapped animal. Then, suddenly, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You don't understand," he said, slumping into one of the porch chairs. "This place is bleeding money. The crops barely break even, the equipment needs replacing, and there are back taxes owed. Dad left debts you don't even know about." Dr. Running Bear's voice softened slightly. "So you thought stealing tribal artifacts was the solution?" "I thought—" Ray ran his hands through his hair. "There are collectors who pay top dollar, no questions asked. Enough to save the farm, pay off the debts, maybe even have some left over. Dad was never going to miss a few pieces." "A few pieces?" I pulled out more photographs. "According to my count, you've removed nearly a third of the collection." Ray looked at the evidence spread before him, and I saw something break in his expression. I never meant for it to go this far. It started with just one piece, something small, to help with the mortgage payment. But then there were more bills, and the collectors kept offering more money. Dr. Running Bear's expression was stern, but not entirely unsympathetic. "Where are the artifacts you removed?" Ray gestured weakly toward the barn. "Most of them are in there, packed up and ready to ship. I was going to drive them to Chicago tomorrow." "And the pieces you've already sold?" Ray's voice dropped to barely a whisper. 3 pottery vessels and some arrowheads. Last month. I've got the buyer's contact information. I felt a mixture of anger and sadness watching my uncle's confession. This was my father's brother, a man I'd looked up to as a child, reduced to grave robbing and theft. Dr. Running Bear pulled out her phone. "I need to make some calls. This is now a federal matter. Trafficking in Native American artifacts is a serious crime. But given your cooperation and the fact that most of the collection is still intact, there might be ways to handle this that don't involve lengthy prison sentences." Ray looked up hopefully. "What kind of ways?" "Full restitution, return of everything you've taken, help recovering the pieces you've sold, and cooperation with a full inventory of the collection. In exchange, the Tribal Council might be willing to recommend reduced charges, possibly community service and restitution instead of jail time." I found myself speaking up. "What about the farm's financial problems?" Dr. Running Bear looked at me thoughtfully. "Your grandfather and we had discussed a partnership. The tribal nation would help establish the museum, provide ongoing funding for preservation and education programs. It would generate income for the property while honoring both the agricultural and cultural heritage of the land." Ray stared at her in disbelief. "You mean there was already a plan to make money from this legally? Your father was trying to tell you about it, according to his letters. He wanted you to be part of it, to help manage the agricultural side while we handled the cultural preservation." Her voice carried a note of sadness. "If you'd just talked to him instead of assuming he was keeping secrets." The implications hit Ray like a physical blow. He'd been stealing artifacts to save a farm that was already on track to be saved legally and ethically. Over the next several hours, we conducted a complete inventory of the barn's hidden room. Dr. Running Bear documented everything while Ray, looking increasingly devastated, helped identify which pieces he'd moved or sold. The full scope of Grandpa's project became clear as we worked. He'd been conducting an archaeological survey of the entire property for over 30 years, carefully cataloguing every artifact he found while farming. Instead of selling them or keeping them as curiosities, he'd preserved them with museum-quality care. "This is one of the most comprehensive private collections I've ever seen," Dr. Running Bear said, examining a particularly beautiful piece of pottery. "Your grandfather found evidence of continuous habitation spanning at least 800 years. This property was clearly a significant settlement site." I thought about Grandpa working alone all those years, patiently documenting each find, building this secret archive while maintaining his farm above. The dedication it must have taken was staggering. Ray sat at the desk, reading through correspondence between Grandpa and various institutions. "He wrote to me about this," he said quietly, holding up a letter. "6 months ago. I thought he was just rambling about old bones and broken pottery. I didn't read past the first paragraph." "He was trying to include you in something important," Dr. Running Bear said. "He wanted this to be a family legacy, not just an individual project." By evening, we had a complete picture. Ray had removed 43 artifacts worth an estimated $60,000. 3 pieces had been sold for $8,000 total, a fraction of their actual value, both monetary and cultural. Everything else was still in the barn, packed in boxes and ready to ship. Dr. Running Bear made her calls to tribal authorities and federal agencies. The response was surprisingly positive. Ray's cooperation and the intact state of most of the collection would definitely be factors in his favor when charges were filed. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we restore everything and move forward with your grandfather's plan," she said. "If you're willing to honor his agreements, that is." 6 months later, I stood in the barn, now converted into the Thomas Whitfield Agricultural and Cultural Heritage Museum, watching visitors examine Grandpa's carefully preserved artifacts. The space had been transformed with proper climate control, professional display cases, and educational materials that told the story of both the Native American families who had lived on this land and the farming families who had followed. Ray worked alongside me, no longer the bitter, desperate man I'd confronted that day. The federal charges had been reduced to misdemeanors in exchange for his cooperation and community service, which he was serving by helping to establish and run the museum. The buyers of the stolen artifacts had been contacted, and all 3 pieces were returned without legal action. The museum generated enough income to cover the farm's expenses, and then some. I'd moved to the property permanently, learning to balance agricultural work with my role as museum coordinator. Ray handled the farming side, while I worked with Dr. Running Bear on educational programs and artifact preservation. "Your grandfather would be proud, Dr. I." Running Bear said, joining me near the display of pottery vessels. "He always said this place had stories to tell." I nodded, thinking about the man who'd spent decades patiently uncovering those stories, preserving them for future generations instead of profiting from them. The barn floor that Ray had been so sure would cave in had instead opened up to reveal treasures beyond anything either of us had imagined. That evening, as I walked through the fields where corn would soon be planted again, I thought about second chances and the weight of family legacy. Ray had made serious mistakes, but he was working to make amends. I'd almost walked away from something extraordinary because I'd been too proud to see past surface conflicts. The old barn stood solid against the sunset sky, no longer hiding secrets, but openly sharing the wisdom of generations. And somewhere, I like to think, Grandpa was satisfied that his careful work would continue long after he was gone. Thank you for listening to this story of family, heritage, and redemption. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Please let me know where you're listening from around the world, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones we preserve for others rather than keeping for ourselves.